Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to
So Ms. Sanam Naraghi Anderlini, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us. Now, over the last 24 hours, Israel has carried out quite a number of airstrikes against various targets throughout Iran, and of course this must resonate very closely with you, bearing in mind that you're originally from Iran. And I was wondering if you could share some first thoughts and comments. And of course, regarding Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he has been quite determined to start the war with Iran over the last couple of months. And it seems like now he has been given the green light from the Trump administration to do as he likes, not only in Gaza, but also in Syria and now in Iran.
Yes, thank you for raising that and addressing it. My thoughts obviously are with the Iranian people, with the men and the women and the children and the elderly and my relatives who are there. Last night, from what we saw, the bombs were being dropped across the city in urban areas, in neighborhoods that are very residential and
so not military sites at all?
Perhaps also military sites, but certainly residential sites. And we've seen this playbook in Syria, in Lebanon, in Gaza, this narrative that the Israeli regime keeps sharing with the international community that they are targeting just military sites, and then you see how many civilians are being killed. So I think that it's really important that we acknowledge that civilians are being killed, and acknowledge that these are, in their own words, these are preemptive strikes. Iran was in dialogue with the United States. So this is an attempt to sabotage those negotiations and likely to draw the US into another Middle East war. Because, of course, what they're doing is they're trying to provoke a retaliation from Iran. So this is a manufactured war. It's an entirely manufactured war. And I hope that the international community will take a stronger stance and stop arming Israel, because their behavior in the region, as you said, from Gaza to the West Bank to Syria, Palestine, Yemen, and now Iran, this is a predatory state, right, which is creating a lot of insecurity.
But the amount of anti-Iran propaganda has been astonishing over the past years, and it seems to have been driven primarily by Israel and its proxies in the United States, especially the far-right elements within the US administration, the hawks. Why does Israel perceive the Islamic regime, the Islamic government in Iran, as an existential threat?
So I think it's important to go back in history a little bit. When this regime took power in Iran, this Islamist regime, it's not an Islamic, it's an Islamist regime, and the Iran-Iraq war was going on, Israel was allied with Iran against Saddam Hussein. So this is not an identity conflict.
And Trita Parsi wrote an entire book about Israel arming Iran.
Exactly. And so it's also not a Jewish-Muslim conflict, because in Iran we have a Jewish community, we have synagogues. Even under this regime they've been practicing and they live freely, and we even have a representation in the parliament. We've always had that. So it's not an identity conflict in the way some like to shape the narrative. And the question of is it existential or not is important, because we have heard rhetoric from Iran, from this regime, from the Iranian regime, for many years about anti-Zionism, the anti-Zionist regime. But it's always been tied to the question of the status of Palestine and what the Palestinians want. And over time, they have made statements very clearly saying, if Palestinians reach an accord with Israel and determine two-state solution or whatever it may be, Iran doesn't have, will stand with the Palestinian cause. So the issue at the end of the day comes back to Israel's takeover of the West Bank and Gaza, and having an external enemy is beneficial to them. And it's a useful narrative.
To both governments?
To both governments, but predominantly actually to the Israeli government. Because the question of a nuclear deterrence, if you're sitting in Iran and you've had 8 years experience of the Iran-Iraq war, where the entire world sided with Saddam, where you had chemical attacks happening against Iranian soldiers, you become very defensive of your territory and of your population. And if we look back in the last 20 years and we see how the revolution in Libya and what happened to Iraq and what happened to Syria and what's happened to Ukraine as they were forced to give up their nuclear weapons and the invasion of Russia, anybody who looks at it logically would say we are living in the era of power politics. I wouldn't say strong men, but power politics. And this is the language that the major powers understand. So it's forcing the Iranians to go in a direction that historically has not been what they wanted. And the preemption of this war now is really, it's either the end of an era in the sense that the world should wake up and say enough of this violence, or it's the harbinger of a very, very dark time for all of us. So, and I hope that it's the previous. I hope this will be a moment where we can mitigate, contain, and revisit the issues in the region.
Right. Now, you're here in Sarajevo attending the Women, Peace and Security Conference organized by the United Nations, and it's been, I believe, 2 decades since the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, but we still see persistent gaps in the implementation of this resolution, particularly in conflict-affected areas. So what, in your assessment, are the most perhaps entrenched barriers to meaningful integration of WPS principles in national security policies, and which actors are most responsible for driving genuine change?
So I'll answer it in two ways. So who are the actors that are most responsible for maintaining peace and security within our countries and human security for our nations, whether it's your nation or mine or otherwise? Of course, our governments. They are responsible. Are they taking that responsibility seriously? In many cases, no. In many cases, in the worst case scenarios, you have governments that are predatory towards their own public, and instigate wars, and so we've had civil wars, which is the reason why we initiated the Women, Peace and Security agenda back in the late 1990s and in October of 2000, because we as women who had the lived experience of conflict and women who had borne the burdens of violence and taken on the responsibility to protect their communities and mitigate and mediate with armed actors and so forth, we're saying, our governments aren't protecting us. The militias aren't doing. We need a say in the discussions of peace and security for our own countries. So, first instance, the responsibility sits with governments, and then, as the United Nations. Where does the responsibility actually sit right now? Who is taking on the responsibility to protect and implement this agenda? It is sitting with women-led civil society organizations, women's peacebuilding organizations in Yemen, in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Colombia, in every war zone. When the powers that be instigate a war, it is the people on the ground who are the first to rise, to warn, to take action, to try and protect our communities. So the question for me 25 years on is, are we willing to recognize them as peace actors? Are we willing to recognize that there is a theater of conflict, but that theater of conflict is not just the armed entities, it is also the peace entities? And are we as an international community willing to stand by our commitments to the WPS agenda or to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the UN Charter to say we are going to stand with and in support of the peace actors, not just the warring actors? We need to talk to the warring actors to stop them, but they should not be empowered and enabled in these processes, because violence should not be the ticket to the future. And power sharing, if we're going to have power sharing, it should come with responsibility sharing. These are the kinds of things that we're seeing from the ground up happen.
Well, you know what's interesting? Countries like Bosnia, which has gone through a genocide during the 1990s, and in the cases of Srebrenica, where men were massacred, it was women, Bosnian Muslim women, who spearheaded efforts to find A, the remains of their husbands, sons, cousins, and B, it was them that approached and testified in front of the international, the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague, not only for Srebrenica, but for other towns throughout Bosnia as well. Yet, when it comes to the political representation today, it seems to be quite tokenistic, And I was wondering if when you compare Bosnia to other conflict zones around the world, I mean, it's women mostly who have some basic education, who spearhead these movements to find their loved ones, and seek justice. But when it comes to being players in the government, it's quite their roles are quite minimal and rather symbolic. Why this huge gap?
This is exactly the issue. So first of all, the agenda, one of the inspirations for the agenda was the courage and the compassion that Bosnian women showed in those times. And it sits very strongly in our hearts, that the inspiration that they gave us. Secondly, it is exactly the kinds of agreements such as the Dayton Accords, or for example, what was done in Afghanistan in 2021, where the negotiation was with the Taliban and they were enabled and empowered and basically handed the country. And women who had been warning, women who had been doing the peace work and actually doing peace building from the ground up. They didn't want the occupation, but they didn't want the Taliban either. The international community ignored and sidelined and marginalized them.
Completely, yeah.
And the issue is that so long as the political leaders and the diplomats that are charged with addressing these processes, so if we're having a UN envoy or an envoy from the United States or elsewhere, who takes the lead on designing the process and designs the process in an exclusive way that says, okay, we'll bring the heads of each of the militias, or we'll bring the heads of just the political parties, and ignoring the women, they are abrogating their responsibility. They are basically breaking international law, because we have 10 Security Council resolutions. And in some cases where countries have 114 countries have national action plans on women, peace and security, a number, including the United States, we even have a law. So if you exclude the women from the processes that you're enabling and supporting, you're actually breaking your own law. The biggest problem is that there's no accountability. And this is one of the challenges that we are all dealing with, because, again, the powerful are abrogating their responsibility.
Even when it comes to combating violent extremism, it tends to be analyzed through a male-centric security lens. I mean, I was wondering, in your opinion, what do current counter-extremism frameworks overlook when they fail to take into consideration gendered experiences? And how can a feminist security approach, we've been speaking a lot about a feminist security approach, a feminist foreign policy, how can it reframe state responsibilities to radicalization and violence?
So again, in the work that we've done at ICANN, the organization I founded, and a network of women's peacebuilding organizations in 42 countries, we have many partners that have been encountering the problem of violent extremism. And from the lens of women and from the experiences of women, and a feminist lens if you want, there are a number of things that we do. Number one is, first of all, understand who these people are and how they operate. So what we've seen across the board is these are movements that weaponize what I call visceral identity, your faith, your ethno-national identity, and your gender, right? It's talking to the heart to get to the head. Second, they are locally rooted and globally connected. So when we had the spate of the jihadi movements, Boko Haram in Nigeria, Al-Shabaab in Kenya, Taliban in Pakistan and Afghanistan, ISIS, etc., they had the same ideology, but they were integral to the communities that they came from. And so they were able to feel the aspirations and the grievances of people there. And they would change their messaging to adapt to the aspirations. So to young men, they would be saying, you can come, we give you purpose, we give you belonging. If jobs were few, we'll give you a job, we'll make you a hero. But also to women. They are very clever because they've understood that women have deep influence and power within the kinship structures. And so in Pakistan, for example.
What did they promise women?
So in Pakistan, on the radio, back in 2008, there was a sheikh that was saying to the women, you're feeling injustice in the society. There's corruption in the society. Join us, send us your sons, give us your gold, and we will create a just society. They radicalized these women, made them feel powerful, and understood that through the women they could get so many others. So in our work, we have been doing that kind of analysis to say, what is the gendered lens? But more, and then the second piece is that the international discourse is we have to prevent violent extremism. We have to counter violent extremism. It's a negative framing. We're saying we're against something, but we're not actually offering those people who are vulnerable to the radicalization message something positive. So to the same young men or to the same women, if they have aspirations because they want to have a better life, if they want dignity, if they feel that they've been the victims of corruption in their state, we need to give them a positive alternative.
Right, but do you think, are you under the impression that international organizations that have been primarily funding the countering violent extremism project throughout the Middle East, the Muslim, what we commonly refer to as the Muslim world, although it's quite an imprecise term, do you think that they grossly misunderstand the Middle East and Central Asia?
I think they understand the region, they understand how our societies are genuinely like a Persian carpet, a weaving of a fabric of multiple ethnicities, multiple faiths, and so forth, that we've all lived together for very long. And at the core of it, there is a misunderstanding of the human dimension. Yeah. A young man in Bosnia or in Yemen or in Nigeria isn't born, doesn't grow up being extreme, being violent. Things happen to him. Things are done that forces him, whether he's pulled and trained in a certain way, whether he's a victim of violence in a certain way. So you have to look at the unit of analysis for violent extremists are individuals. The unit of analysis for states and multilaterals are governments and so forth. But these movements that are transnational are able to work deep inside communities and get into the human dimension of it. And this is what we need to be addressing. At the core of it, there's a question of dignity. And if you're a young man with no hope and somebody comes and says, maybe it's a false message, but you come and I give you dignity and I give you power.
And you give a sense of purpose.
And sense of purpose. And as I say, promises you not only money, but if you die, your family also goes to heaven in 7 generations. That's a pretty good deal compared to something that your state, the state that should have been addressing your needs and should have been giving you an opportunity for a dignified life, hasn't done. And we see that with women as well. In Nigeria, some of the girls that were kidnapped by Boko Haram and became radicalized, when they came out, they said, I had a better life under Boko Haram. I had a fridge. I learned how to read the Quran. In my own community, I was illiterate, I had nothing. So it really comes down to how are we treating our own people. And where we leave vacuums or where we are predatory, there are these forces that are emerging. It's in the Sunni Islamist world, you can have the jihadis. In the Western world, it's white supremacy. Yeah. It's the far right movement. They're very, very similar in how they elevate a singular identity of white or white Christian, and say you're better than the others. But it's about tapping into aspirations and grievances of men and women.
Mm-hmm. Now, rhetoric around male allies has been growing, but seems to lack in substance. And I was wondering, what criteria do you use to distinguish between performative, allyship and authentic male engagement in advancing the WPS agenda?
First thing I would say is that what I find extraordinary, that is often not talked about, is that as women peace builders in context of conflict, many are engaging men from the outset. They're concerned, as I said, about the boys that might be radicalized, or about the men that have come back traumatized from conflict, or protecting the men, frankly, from being recruited and so forth. So as peace builders, women have always taken into account that their circles of concern, their fathers, their sons, their brothers, etc. That's one level.
It's quite a heavy burden for women.
It's a very heavy burden, and it's an unrecognized burden.
Yeah.
Right. And in very macho societies, very often women are the ones who will come and show emotion in public about the traumas because the men can't show their emotions. Yeah. They will come and talk about things that men cannot. Because the society hasn't enabled them to show vulnerability. So there's that dimension that women are showing allyship to men. Right? Now, the other side of it, of men showing allyship to women, it is very, very limited. I often go to meetings and we're talking about strong, important security issues. If you label it as women or gender, there are very few men in the room because they think it's just a women's issue, right? So one is to come and listen and engage and recognize that when we talk about security as women and from a feminist lens, we are talking about human security. We are talking about transformative equality. So very simply, I say, I am against war. War is not good for anyone, maybe the weapons industry, but war as a way of dealing with conflict hurts everyone. the Women, Peace and Security agenda is not an agenda that says, oh, we want equality so that our daughters can also go to war. It's an agenda that says we want to make sure that we never have war again, so that neither our sons nor our daughters have to ever experience the hell of war or a Srebrenica experience. So we need men to understand this framing and engage. And sadly, because they don't come, because these discussions are so siloed, we have very few appearing. And then the other aspect of this is we need men to join us in the discussions of violence and sexual violence that's perpetrated. Many men become very defensive. They say, oh, I don't do that. And we say, we understand. We're not saying that all men do this. I don't either. But it's an issue. It's a problem in society. It is this kind of violence, whether domestic or conflict-related, is perpetrated overwhelmingly by men. And we need other men to engage and talk to men. And we need spaces where we can enable men to understand that if you're angry, if you're frustrated, how do you process that anger and frustration so that you're not actually hurting the people that you care about most? If you think about Ukrainian soldiers coming home, they're defending their nation, they're protecting their nation, but they bring the trauma of the war home, and there's huge levels of violence at home, in domestic violence. If you think about the United States, soldiers were, young men were recruited, young men and women were recruited to go to the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan. Horrific things happened there. They were traumatized. They have come home, and there are 4 times as many suicides by active and retired servicemen and women in America than were killed during the war. So our agenda is about
that's striking.
Protecting and preventing this for everybody. And we need men to join us in this conversation, because you know better than I do, when war breaks out, men are the first ones to be recruited and sent off.
Mm-hmm. Now, as we move towards the end of our interview, I wanted to ask you one final question. Drawing from your cross-continental career, is there a defining moment in your life that, that crystallized for you this transformative potential of women's leadership in peace building, especially under the most adverse circumstances? I mean, what countries, what groups, what individuals have been most inspirational to your work?
I work with literally the United Nations of women peace builders from around the world. So as you ask this question, the faces of so many of them appear in my mind. But I will share maybe 2 stories. The first one goes back to 1998, when we had the first global conference of women in armed conflict in London that led to us initiating a campaign for 1325. And there's a woman from Rwanda, and she was speaking about the need to look to the future and to build peace and reconciliation in their country. It was 4 years after their genocide. She had very sad eyes, and I was listening to this woman and thinking, 4 years, where is the heart? What kind of a person do you have to have that compassion, to be able, and the strength to be able to say we need to look forward and not get stuck in the horrors of the past.
Or seek revenge.
Or seek revenge and perpetrate the violence that was done to you, taking that forward. And she had lost 100 relatives, I found out. And to this day, when I think of her, I don't know what I would do if that were me. And this is something that we have to acknowledge, that not everybody has that capacity, right? And so the people who do are heroes. They are superheroes. The second is one of my dear colleagues from Sri Lanka, whose son was in the Sri Lankan army and he went missing. And she was trying to find out what happened to him. And in trying to get some accountability from her own Ministry of Defense, she gathered a group of other mothers of missing servicemen, and together they were the first ones to walk into the jungles, unarmed, to go and talk to the Tamil Tigers that were recognized as one of the most violent, independent movements at the time. And these women sat with these militia fighters, and she says, when I saw them, I saw that they are somebody else's son, and they are like my son. And she initiated a dialogue which continued, and she continued to be one of the most important people in her country in terms of bringing together from across the divide. And right now she continues to work with the Buddhist community and the Tamil diaspora and so forth. And again, I think about what it takes to have lost your child and to have taken that pain and turned it into something positive, and with the, as they say, the heart and the courage to say, I don't want this to happen to some other mother. I don't want this to happen to some other son. So this is what peace builders are, and they are everywhere amongst us. There are so many here in Bosnia. They are the superheroes of our era, and it's a privilege to know them and work with them.
Right, Ms. Sanam, it was such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.